In 2000, when Michael Jackson told music executives physical albums will soon be dead. Music will be distributed digitally, through streaming, most thought he was just dreaming. That same year, Steve Jobs was stunned to encounter someone who had this vision long before him, the king of pop. The secret collaboration between these two unexpected visionaries predicted how music consumption would change decades in advance and laid the foundations for Apple's music empire. This is technology history's best-kept secret. If these kinds of stories catch your attention, don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. Where are you watching us from right now? Let us know in the comments below. The year 2000 marked a pivotal moment in the music industry. CD sales were at their peak, generating unprecedented revenue for record labels. The MP3 format existed but was primarily associated with piracy through services like Napster, which had launched the previous year. The idea of legitimate digital music distribution was still considered fringe by most industry executives, who were focused on protecting their lucrative physical media business. The recording industry was enjoying its most profitable era, with global music sales reaching nearly $40 billion annually, largely driven by the CD format that had effectively replaced cassettes and vinyl. Major record labels were powerful gatekeepers, controlling not just the production of music but also its distribution through a well-established network of physical retailers. The prevailing wisdom in corner offices at Sony Music, Warner, Universal, and EMI was that this golden age would continue indefinitely, with perhaps minor evolutionary adjustments. This complacency created a significant blind spot. While industry executives were celebrating record profits, they were largely ignoring the technological revolution brewing on the horizon. File-sharing services like Napster were gaining millions of users, demonstrating massive consumer appetite for digital music. Instead of recognizing this as a signal to evolve their business model, most labels responded with litigation and resistance. Against this backdrop, an unlikely meeting took place that would ultimately help shape the future of music consumption, though few people knew about it at the time. Michael Jackson, despite his public persona being increasingly defined by controversies and eccentricities, had developed a remarkably prescient understanding of how technology would transform the music industry. This insight wasn't coincidental. It was the product of his unique position as both an artist and a savvy business figure who had built an impressive portfolio of music publishing rights, including the Beatles' catalog. Jackson's business acumen had been demonstrated most dramatically in 1985 when he outbid Paul McCartney to acquire ATV Music, which owned the rights to most Beatles songs, for $47.5 million, a move that shocked the music industry and created a rift with McCartney. By 1995, Jackson had merged his ATV assets with Sony to create Sony/ATV Music Publishing, one of the world's largest music publishing companies. This gave him an ownership stake in not just his own music, but in a vast catalog spanning multiple genres and eras. This position provided Jackson with a perspective few others in the industry had. He understood music not just as an artist creating it or a label promoting it, but as an asset whose value depended on how effectively it could be monetized across multiple platforms and formats. This comprehensive view allowed him to see beyond the immediate concerns of CD sales to the longer-term evolution of music distribution. Michael was obsessively interested in the business side of music, recalled John Branca, Jackson's longtime attorney who helped orchestrate many of his business deals. He didn't just want to create music, he wanted to understand how it reached people and how that process was evolving. He was tracking digital technology trends long before most executives in the industry were paying attention. This interest wasn't merely theoretical. Jackson had invested in various technology ventures throughout the 1990s, including early internet companies and digital media startups. He had regular briefings from technology consultants who kept him informed about emerging formats and distribution methods. While many artists of his stature were focused solely on their creative output, Jackson was actively studying how technology was reshaping the landscape in which that creativity would exist. Jackson had been following the development of digital audio formats since the early 1990s, recognizing their potential to revolutionize music distribution. By 1998, he had begun speaking privately about a future where physical media would become obsolete, replaced by digital files that could be instantly delivered to consumers. Michael started talking about digital distribution around 1996, said one former business associate. He was frustrated with the limitations of physical media, not just the production and distribution costs, but how it constrained the artistic experience. He kept saying that technology would eventually allow artists to deliver music directly to fans in more immediate and interactive ways. Most people thought he was being eccentric, but he was actually being prescient. Jackson's interest in digital music wasn't limited to distribution. He was equally fascinated by how technology could transform the creative process itself. He had been an early adopter of digital recording techniques and was continually experimenting with new ways to produce and enhance his sound. This hands-on experience with music technology gave him insights into its potential that many business executives, removed from the creative process, simply didn't have. Steve Jobs, meanwhile, was in the early stages of Apple's renaissance. Having returned to the company in 1997, he had successfully launched the iMac and was looking for new opportunities to expand Apple's ecosystem. Music, with its universal appeal and emotional connection, represented an intriguing possibility, though Jobs had not yet developed a clear strategy for entering the space. Jobs' journey with Apple had been tumultuous. After being forced out of the company he co-founded in 1985, he had spent years developing Next Computer and investing in Pixar before returning to a struggling Apple in 1997. His immediate focus had been on streamlining the product line and restoring the company's innovative edge with the colorful, consumer-friendly iMac. By 2000, he had stabilized Apple's core computer business, but the company remained a niche player in the larger technology landscape. To truly revitalize Apple, Jobs knew he needed to expand beyond traditional computing. He had been exploring various digital lifestyle applications, recognizing that computers could become hubs for managing photos, videos, and other personal media. Music, with its universal appeal and daily presence in people's lives, seemed like an obvious area for expansion, but Apple had yet to develop a comprehensive strategy for this space. Jobs had been aware of MP3 players since their emergence in the late 1990s but was unimpressed with the existing offerings. Devices like the Diamond Rio had limited storage and cumbersome interfaces, while the software for managing digital music libraries was primitive and unintuitive. Jobs saw an opportunity to create a more elegant, integrated solution, but was still developing his vision for what that might entail. The exact circumstances of their first meeting remain the subject of conflicting accounts. According to some sources, it was arranged through mutual connections in the entertainment industry. Others suggest it occurred more serendipitously at a technology conference where both were in attendance. What's clear is that sometime in late 2000, Jackson and Jobs found themselves discussing the future of music technology, and both were surprised by what the other brought to the conversation. Steve expected to be the visionary in the room when it came to technology, said one former Apple executive who was familiar with the meeting but requested anonymity. He was taken aback when Michael started describing a future for music distribution that was more advanced than anything Apple had on the drawing board at that point. It wasn't just that Michael had ideas, it was that he had thought through the implications from both the technology and music industry perspectives. The meeting reportedly took place at a private residence in the San Francisco Bay Area, arranged by a mutual acquaintance who had connections in both the technology and entertainment worlds. Jobs arrived expecting a brief, cordial conversation with a music celebrity who might eventually be useful for Apple's emerging digital music plans. Instead, he encountered someone with a sophisticated understanding of how digital technology was poised to transform the entire music ecosystem. According to those who were present, Jackson outlined a vision where consumers would have access to virtually all recorded music through portable devices, with multiple payment models including both ownership and subscription-based access. He described how this would change everything from production to promotion to consumption patterns. Michael talked about how people would carry their entire music libraries in their pockets, recalled one attendee. But he went beyond that. He described how recommendation systems would help people discover new music based on their listening habits, how artists would release music directly to fans without physical production delays, how visual elements would be integrated with the audio experience. It was comprehensive and remarkably accurate about where things would eventually go. What particularly impressed Jobs was Jackson's understanding that this transition wasn't simply a technological shift but a fundamental reimagining of the relationship between artists, labels, and listeners. While many technologists saw digital distribution primarily as a more efficient delivery mechanism, Jackson recognized it would completely transform how people discovered, shared, and experienced music. Michael told Steve something that really struck him, recalled one attendee of that initial meeting. He said, "The physical object isn't what people want, it's the emotional experience of the music. If you can deliver that experience more immediately, more personally, and connect it to more aspects of people's lives, that's where the future lies." That insight, that Apple should focus on the experience rather than just the delivery technology, became central to how they approached iTunes and later Apple Music. Jobs, known for his strong opinions and occasional dismissiveness of others' ideas, was uncharacteristically receptive. He recognized in Jackson a kindred spirit, someone who, like himself, had achieved enormous success by combining artistic sensibility with technological innovation and a deep understanding of consumer psychology. "Steve was genuinely impressed," said one Apple employee who later heard Jobs discuss the meeting. "He came back to Apple and told a few of us, 'I just had one of the most interesting conversations about the future of music, and it wasn't with anyone in our industry.'" He didn't elaborate much, but he mentioned that Michael Jackson understood digital music better than most tech executives he'd met. Following this initial encounter, Jobs and Jackson began a series of private meetings that would continue, with varying frequency, over the next several years. These conversations were kept deliberately low profile. Jobs was known for his secrecy around product development, while Jackson valued privacy as his public image became increasingly complicated. The meetings typically occurred away from both Apple headquarters and Jackson's public appearances. Sometimes they would meet at private homes in the Bay Area. Other times, when Jackson was traveling, Jobs would arrange to meet him at hotels or other discreet locations. Only a small circle of trusted associates on either side were aware of these ongoing discussions. There was a mutual benefit to keeping their interactions quiet, explained one person familiar with the relationship. Steve was still developing Apple's music strategy and didn't want competitors to know his direction. Michael, for his part, was navigating complex relationships with record labels who might have viewed his collaboration with a tech company as potentially threatening to their business models. The content of these meetings evolved over time, from broad discussions about the future of music technology to specific conversations about features, user experiences, and business models. As Apple began developing what would become iTunes and the iPod, Jackson's input became increasingly focused on practical aspects of implementation. The collaboration intensified in early 2001 as Apple began serious development of what would eventually become iTunes and the iPod. Jackson provided invaluable insights into how artists and labels thought about digital rights, helping Jobs understand the concerns that needed to be addressed for major labels to embrace digital distribution. Michael essentially served as a bridge between Silicon Valley and the music industry at a time when there was enormous mistrust between the two, said one music industry executive who later learned of Jackson's role. He understood both worlds and could translate between them. He helped Steve understand why certain features mattered to artists and labels, while also helping prepare music executives for the digital transition that was coming whether they liked it or not. This bridging function proved crucial. The early 2000s were characterized by deep antagonism between the technology and music industries. Record labels viewed technology companies as enablers of piracy, while tech companies saw labels as dinosaurs resisting inevitable change. Jackson, with feet in both worlds, could help each side understand the other's legitimate concerns and interests. For Jobs, who was preparing to approach major labels about licensing their catalogs for iTunes, this insight was invaluable. Jackson helped him understand the complex web of rights that govern music distribution and the various stakeholders, artists, publishers, labels, whose interests needed to be addressed in any digital music platform. One of Jackson's most significant contributions was his insight into the user experience of digital music. Having spent his career meticulously crafting albums as cohesive artistic statements, he was concerned about music becoming reduced to a random collection of tracks. He pushed for features that would preserve the album experience while embracing the flexibility of digital formats. Michael was adamant that the album shouldn't die as an art form, said one Apple designer who worked on early iTunes iterations. Some of the features for showcasing album artwork, liner notes, and maintaining the connection between tracks came directly from his input. He understood that while people might want the freedom to create playlists and mix artists, there was still value in experiencing an album as the artist intended. This perspective influenced how iTunes displayed and organized music, with album artwork and information prominently featured. It also informed the decision to make track purchases part of a coherent album structure within the user's library, rather than treating each song as a completely independent entity. Jackson also emphasized the importance of sound quality, pushing back against the notion that consumers wouldn't care about compression artifacts and reduced fidelity. He arranged listening sessions where he played identical music through different digital formats and compression levels to demonstrate how these technical choices affected the emotional impact of the music. Michael would bring these high-end headphones and have Steve listen to different versions of the same tracks, recalled one engineer who was present for one such demonstration. He'd play an uncompressed master, then an MP3 at different bit rates, and ask Steve to notice how the emotion and presence of the music changed. He was making the point that if Apple wanted to be the premium brand for music, they couldn't just focus on convenience, quality had to be part of the equation too. As development of iTunes progressed, Jackson's role evolved from general advisor to specific product consultant. He would periodically visit Apple headquarters in Cupertino, carefully scheduled to avoid publicity, where he would review prototypes and provide feedback on everything from user interface to sound quality. There was this surreal situation where Michael Jackson would be sitting in our conference room, handling prototype iPods and offering detailed feedback on the scroll wheel mechanism or the organization of the music library, recalled one Apple engineer. Here was this global superstar, but in those meetings, he was just an incredibly knowledgeable, passionate person helping us make a better product. These visits were tightly controlled, with only essential personnel present and no documentation that might leak to the press. Jobs, always concerned about secrecy around Apple's product development, was particularly careful to limit knowledge of Jackson's involvement to a small circle of trusted employees. For Apple's design team, Jackson's feedback provided a valuable perspective they couldn't get elsewhere, that of a musician who understood both the creative and business aspects of the industry at the highest level. His specific suggestions influenced numerous features, from how playlists functioned to how album information was displayed. Jackson's understanding of rights management also proved invaluable as Apple navigated the complex landscape of music licensing. His extensive experience with publishing rights and his ownership stakes in various catalogs gave him unique insight into how digital rights needed to be structured to satisfy all stakeholders. Michael helped Steve understand that the key to getting the labels on board wasn't just technology, it was addressing their fear of losing control, explained one person involved in the licensing discussions. He suggested the DRM approach that Apple eventually adopted, protecting the content enough to satisfy the labels while making it convenient enough that consumers would choose it over piracy. That balance was critical to iTunes' early success. Through his Sony/ATV connection, Jackson also had relationships with key executives at major labels. While he didn't directly negotiate on Apple's behalf, he helped prepare the ground by privately discussing digital distribution with industry leaders, helping them understand that properly implemented digital platforms could represent an opportunity rather than a threat. When iTunes launched in 2003, followed shortly by the iTunes Store, Jobs became the public face of Apple's music revolution. In his iconic presentations, he outlined a vision for digital music that incorporated many of the ideas that had emerged from his conversations with Jackson, though he never publicly acknowledged this influence. The iTunes Store represented a radical departure from existing digital music services. Rather than a subscription model like the early Rhapsody service or the free, but legally questionable, Napster, Apple offered individual track purchases at 99 cents, a price point that Jackson had reportedly advocated for as psychologically appealing to consumers while providing sufficient revenue when multiplied across millions of transactions. The store's design emphasized simplicity and immediate gratification. Users could purchase and download songs with a single click, a stark contrast to the complex interfaces of other services. This focus on user experience over technical features reflected Jackson's input about putting the emotional connection to music at the center of the product. The initial success of iTunes and the iPod exceeded even Apple's optimistic projections. Within 2 years, Apple had sold over 500 million songs through the iTunes Store and established itself as the dominant platform for legal digital music. This success transformed Apple from a computer company with a devoted but limited user base to a consumer electronics giant with broad appeal. Behind the scenes, Jackson continued to consult on Apple's evolving music strategy, though his direct involvement decreased as his legal troubles and personal challenges intensified in the mid-2000s. However, many of his early insights continued to inform Apple's approach, particularly his belief that streaming would eventually replace ownership as the dominant model of music consumption. As early as 2002, Michael was talking about a subscription service where you could access all music for a monthly fee, said one Apple executive who was privy to these discussions. That was years before Spotify existed and at least a decade before Apple launched Apple Music. But he insisted that was where consumer behavior would eventually go, and he was absolutely right. Jackson's vision for streaming was remarkably comprehensive. He described a service where users would have unlimited access to music for a monthly fee, with artists compensated based on how often their music was played. He predicted that this model would eventually become dominant because it aligned with how people actually wanted to experience music, with freedom to explore and discover without the friction of individual purchases. Michael kept saying that owning music was a legacy of the physical media era, recalled one Apple employee. He predicted that once people got used to the convenience of accessing any song instantly, ownership would seem unnecessary for most listeners. He compared it to how people had moved from buying films on VHS to renting them, and predicted a similar shift would happen with music. This insight was somewhat controversial within Apple, where the iTunes Store's purchase model was generating significant revenue. Jobs himself was reportedly skeptical at first, believing that people would want to own their favorite music rather than rent access to it. However, as streaming services began to gain traction in the late 2000s, the prescience of Jackson's prediction became increasingly apparent. Jackson also predicted the importance of mobile devices for music consumption, encouraging Apple to integrate music capabilities into phones long before the iPhone was conceived. His own experience with global touring had shown him how universal music was and how important portable access would become. Michael kept telling Steve, "The future music player isn't a dedicated device, it's a phone," recalled one former Apple engineer. This was around 2003 to 2004, when iPods were selling incredibly well. But Michael insisted that convergence was inevitable, that people wouldn't want to carry multiple devices. That thinking influenced the development of the iPhone, which of course eventually absorbed all the iPod's functionality. This perspective was informed by Jackson's global travels, which had shown him how mobile phones were becoming ubiquitous across different cultures and economic levels. He observed that in many developing countries, people might not have computers but increasingly had mobile phones, making them the logical platform for future music distribution. The concept of music as a mobile, always accessible service rather than a product tied to specific physical media or devices represented a fundamental shift in thinking. It anticipated not just the iPhone but the entire mobile ecosystem that would eventually become the primary platform for music consumption worldwide. Jackson also provided valuable insights into the global nature of music consumption, encouraging Apple to think beyond Western markets from the beginning. He emphasized how different cultures consumed music in different ways and how a truly successful platform would need to accommodate these variations. Michael had performed in countries all over the world and understood how music consumption varied culturally, said one person involved in international expansion planning. He pushed Apple to think about different payment models, different genre organizations, even different visual designs that would work across cultures. That global perspective was unusual in Silicon Valley at that time. As Apple's music ecosystem developed, Jackson's direct involvement waned, particularly after 2005 when his trial and subsequent relocation overseas limited his availability for in-person consultations. However, the foundation he helped establish, viewing digital music through the lens of artist creativity, consumer experience, and industry transformation, continued to guide Apple's approach. The relationship between Jobs and Jackson during this period became more distant but didn't disappear entirely. They would occasionally connect via phone calls or when Jackson's travels brought him to California. Despite the reduced frequency of their interactions, mutual respect remained, with Jobs apparently keeping Jackson informed about major developments in Apple's music strategy. There was a genuine appreciation between them, said one person who knew both men. Steve respected Michael's vision and artistic sensibility, while Michael admired Steve's ability to actually build the products that would deliver on their shared vision. They were very different personalities in many ways, but they connected through this common understanding of how technology and art could combine to create new experiences. When streaming began to emerge as a viable business model in the late 2000s with services like Spotify gaining traction, Apple was initially hesitant to pivot from its successful downloads-based iTunes store. However, internal discussions often referenced Jackson's long-held belief that streaming would eventually become the dominant model. There were strategic meetings at Apple around 2010 to 2011 where executives would literally ask, "What would Michael have said about this?" claimed one former Apple employee. His earlier predictions had proven so accurate that his perspective had become a kind of guiding principle, even years after his active involvement had ended. Jobs himself, who had initially been skeptical of the streaming model, began to acknowledge its growing importance. In one of his final years at Apple's helm, before his death in 2011, he reportedly initiated the internal discussions that would eventually lead to the development of Apple Music, referring back to conversations he'd had with Jackson years earlier about the inevitability of this transition. Jackson's death in 2009 meant he never saw the full realization of the vision he had helped shape. When Apple finally launched Apple Music in 2015, incorporating the streaming model he had advocated for years earlier, it represented the culmination of a journey that had begun with those early conversations between two unlikely collaborators. If you look at Apple Music today, with its combination of curated content, artist connectivity, and integration across devices, you're seeing many of the concepts Michael discussed with Steve 15 years earlier, observed one music industry veteran. The idea that your entire music collection would be available instantly, anywhere, that artists would connect directly with fans through the platform, that the experience would be both personal and social, he saw all of that coming when most people couldn't imagine beyond the CD. Apple Music incorporated many elements that Jackson had advocated for, including human curation alongside algorithmic recommendations, high-quality audio options, visual content integrated with music, and global accessibility across multiple devices. The service represented a full embrace of the streaming model that Jackson had predicted would eventually dominate music consumption. The platform also included features specifically designed to maintain the artistic integrity that Jackson had emphasized, showcasing album artwork, preserving the album as a cohesive unit when appropriate, and providing context about artists and their work. These elements reflected Jackson's concern that digital distribution should enhance rather than diminish the artistic experience of music. The legacy of this collaboration remained largely hidden from public view, with Apple never officially acknowledging Jackson's role in shaping their music strategy. This silence was partly due to Apple's general secrecy around product development, partly due to the complicated public perception of Jackson in his later years, and partly due to the understanding of privacy that had defined their working relationship from the beginning. Some Apple employees who were aware of the collaboration have suggested that there was also an element of corporate storytelling at play. The narrative of Jobs as the singular visionary behind Apple's products was powerful and clean, whereas acknowledging external influences would have complicated that narrative. Whatever the reason, the Jackson-Jobs collaboration remained one of Apple's best-kept secrets. Only in recent years have details begun to emerge, primarily through the recollections of former employees and associates who were present during this pivotal period. These accounts paint a picture of a remarkably productive partnership between two visionaries who, despite coming from vastly different worlds, shared a fundamental understanding of how technology and artistry could converge to transform an industry. What made their collaboration special was that neither was limited by conventional thinking, reflected one person who worked with both men. Steve wasn't just a technologist, and Michael wasn't just an artist. Each understood and respected the other's domain. They weren't creating technology for technology's sake or art for art's sake, they were envisioning how people would experience music in the future. The partnership between Jobs and Jackson represented a rare bridging of the divide between Silicon Valley and the entertainment industry, a divide that has often been characterized by mutual suspicion and misunderstanding. By combining Jackson's deep knowledge of music as both an art form and a business with Jobs' ability to create technology that people connected with emotionally, they were able to envision a future that neither could have fully articulated alone. They complemented each other in important ways, noted one observer of their collaboration. Michael had the artist's perspective and the industry knowledge, but not the technical expertise to implement his vision. Steve had the technical capability and product sense, but benefited enormously from Michael's understanding of how music actually worked as both a creative and commercial enterprise. Together, they were able to see around corners that others couldn't. This collaboration also challenges our common understanding of innovation as primarily a technological process. While the technical aspects of iTunes and the iPod were certainly groundbreaking, equally important was the reimagining of how people would relate to music in a digital environment, the psychological, cultural, and artistic dimensions that Jackson brought to the conversation. The genius of what Apple created wasn't just in the technology, said one music industry executive. It was in understanding how technology could enhance rather than diminish our emotional connection to music. That understanding came from the unique collaboration between someone who had created some of the most emotionally resonant music of all time and someone who had created some of the most emotionally resonant technology. This story serves as a reminder that innovation often happens at unexpected intersections, where different perspectives combine to create something neither could have achieved alone. The digital music revolution that now seems inevitable was shaped in part by conversations between the CEO in a black turtleneck and the king of pop, an unlikely but remarkably effective partnership that helped redefine how the world experiences music. Today, the vision that Jackson and Jobs began discussing in 2000 has become our everyday reality. Music streams continuously through our phones, smart speakers, and other devices. We expect immediate access to virtually any song ever recorded. Artists release music directly to global audiences without physical production delays. Recommendation algorithms help us discover new music while human curation provides context and emotional resonance. In many ways, we're living in the future that Michael and Steve envisioned together, reflected one Apple executive who worked on the music products. The specific technologies and interfaces have evolved, but the fundamental vision, of music as an always available, deeply personal, emotionally rich experience that travels with you everywhere, that vision has been fully realized. As we stream our favorite songs today, seamlessly switching between devices and discovering new artists with algorithmic assistance, we're experiencing a future that was envisioned during those secretive meetings between Jobs and Jackson at the dawn of the millennium, a testament to how far-reaching their shared vision proved to be. The story of their collaboration remains partially hidden, an untold chapter in the history of how digital technology transformed music. But for those who know where to look, the evidence of their shared vision is everywhere. In the music streaming services we use daily, in the integration of music with our mobile devices, and in the new ways artists and audiences connect in the digital age. It's a legacy that continues to evolve and expand, built on a foundation established by two visionaries who saw the future of music more clearly than anyone else.